Isaiah Thomas may be the big-time scorer of the Boston Celtics right now, but it didn't happen overnight. He had to go through some trajectory in his career, changing a few teams, and he finally found a home with the Celtics. And there's actually quite a few players similar to Isaiah, guys who maybe just didn't get drafted to the right team, or it took them a moment to really get comfortable in the NBA. So we're going to talk about a few of those guys today, guys who had to change teams at least one time, and then the original team they were on probably looks at their career now and says, well, we kind of messed that one up. Guys who became star players eventually, even if it didn't happen right away. And we can dive into Isaiah's situation a little bit more. Drafted with the 60th pick in the NBA draft, and what's that called? Mr. Irrelevant or whatever. He had like one media member at his house. And then, within 3 seasons, he was a legit scorer for the Sacramento Kings, putting up 20 points and 6 assists in the 2014 NBA season. So it seemed that the guy who was not taken higher in the draft, probably because of his height, was proving a lot of people wrong. But the Sacramento Kings chose not to retain him. They allowed him to walk in free agency, and then he would find himself as a member of the Phoenix Suns, and we remember how this half season or so went, as the Suns felt that having 3 point guards in Isaiah Thomas, Goran Dragic, and Eric Bledsoe could make them a tough team to deal with their speed and their just skills along the perimeter. Chemistry issues, guys being on the bench. They decided they needed to move Dragic as well as Isaiah Thomas. And that is when the Boston Celtics jumped in and pretty much robbed him. It was a first-round pick and Marcus Thornton. And now Isaiah's averaging 30 points a game. And he's the leader of this Celtics team that's the 2nd seed in the Eastern Conference. He's the king of the 4th quarter, and I think he's the ideal guy to start this whole thing off. But there are quite a few other guys who have had similar situations. Now we're going to look at Kyle Lowry, who in 2011 as well as 2012 was a decent enough point guard for the Houston Rockets. 14 points, 6 assists about. He was a good 3-point shooter, but a lot of his time was really spent deferring to guys like Kevin Martin. The Lowry that we know today with the Toronto Raptors was just simply not there. He seemed like more of a placeholder type of point guard. Now, he may have shown some signs of what he was going to eventually become, but he was really just a guy who couldn't attack the defense too much, wasn't very efficient from the floor. The three-pointer was real, as I've already mentioned, but it just seemed like he was going to be a guy who was in the NBA for a little while, and then he was just going to kind of fade out, and no one was really going to remember him. And he would be like maybe the 3rd to 5th starter on a really good team if he was lucky. However, before the 2013 season, the Toronto Raptors must have saw something in him. They traded a future first-round pick for him, and now he is one of the best guards in the NBA today. His efficiency is shot through the roof. He's the leader of the Toronto Raptors, and he's one of the better all-around players in the NBA today. And the crazy thing is, he's 30 years old. You don't typically see guys have their best season once they hit the 30-year mark, but that's what's happening for Lowry now. And even 5 years ago, I think we all would have been surprised to see him become this good for the Raps. Funny enough, we have a lot of point guards here. Remember the 7 seconds or less Phoenix Suns, and how Steve Nash was putting up about 17 points and 11 assists a game for what seemed like 5 or 6 years with Amari Stoudemire, Sean Marion, a whole lot of shooters, and Mike D'Antoni running it. I mean, these guys could have made an NBA Finals if it wasn't for an unfortunate brawl against the San Antonio Spurs. Nash was the quarterback of one of the more revolutionary teams in NBA history, and I think a team that has a lot of impact on what we see in today's NBA with spacing and small ball fours and high pick and rolls. And again, Nash was the heart of the whole thing. But his career definitely didn't start like that. Similar to Lowry, he really took off around the age of 30 years old. Before ending up on the Suns, he was a member of the Dallas Mavericks with Dirk in the mid-2000s. And he was definitely a solid point guard, as his last about 3 or 4 years in Dallas, he averaged about 16 points, 7 assists, being a very good outside shooter as we know him. So he was not like one of the best point guards in the game necessarily, but he was still very solid and someone who could lead, or at least be the primary ball handler of a very good offensive team, especially him and Dirk. But the Suns threw over $10 million at him over a 6-year contract. And the Mavericks, while definitely valuing what Nash could do for them, they simply felt that was too much. They did not match the deal, and perhaps they'd be regretting that one given how good he was over the next few years for Phoenix. Now, when I was first getting into basketball, Chauncey Billups was one of my favorite players in the league. Mr. Big Shot, and the name definitely made sense with the amount of huge jumpers that he would hit on some winning teams. But in the beginning, he was similar to Kyle Lowry, just another guy for the Minnesota Timberwolves on a team with Kevin Garnett. I mean, he was a good outside shooter, but if you asked Billups to run your offense, people would be like, well, that's just foolish. I mean, why would you have a guy who averages, 12 and 5 be the foundation of your team? But he did have an exciting playoff series in 2002 against the Mavericks in round 1. That was enough for the Detroit Pistons to take a chance on him. And then, as we all know, those Pistons, led by Chauncey, would go on to make the Eastern Conference Finals, 6 or 7 times? I've forgotten the number, but they were a force in the East for a long time, making the NBA Finals more than once, capturing 1 title, and Chauncey was at the heart of a lot of it. His shooting, leadership, and just overall basketball IQ was huge for the Pistons, and it's just wild to see someone who went from floating around the league to having a moment in Minnesota, and then being thought of as one of the better point guards in the league for quite a few years in a row, and constantly being deep into the playoffs. But funny enough, another player on this Pistons team can also apply to this, which is Ben Wallace. Now, those Detroit teams, as much as Billups did for them, they were fantastic defensively, and Ben definitely had a huge part for that. But before the 2000 season, he was actually involved in a sign-and-trade deal with Grant Hill, as Hill would end up on the Orlando Magic and Wallace would be on the Pistons. And then, as we know, he would go on to average double-digit rebounds, and he also won Defensive Player of the Year 4 times between 2002 and 2006. So you could make the argument that Billups was the heart of the team from the backcourt, but Ben was the heart of this Pistons team when it came to all the dirty work inside the paint, whether it be offensive rebounds, finishing plays, and then stopping the opposing team from scoring. Ben was great, and it took a couple of seasons for him to really go off. Now, the James Harden move, I don't want to focus on it too much because I feel like it's kind of been beaten to death in today's NBA. OKC could have done a better job of keeping him. They could have just been willing to go over the cap, or they could have ran some cap gymnastics with trading away Kendrick Perkins and attaching a pick to him. Whatever, they decided to go the super conservative route of trading him, and then he's now leading the Houston Rockets, who are one of the best teams in the league, and he could win the MVP this season, so OKC definitely messed up on that one, and apparently the money wasn't too far off for him. And now finally, we're going to talk about Tracy McGrady, who was initially on the late 1990s Toronto Raptors team, and you could always see his potential as an athlete, as well as a scorer, a playmaker, a rebounder, really an all-around player, but he was never able to really get the minutes until the 2000 season, where he averaged 15 points, 6 rebounds, while a decent amount of time actually coming off the bench for the Raps. So it seemed like this young player in T-Mac was going to really be something. He just needed the minutes to really have that opportunity, but it just wasn't going to happen in Toronto. They let him go to free agency. He ends up on the Orlando Magic, and then over the next 4 seasons would put up over 30 points a game very consistently on a team that didn't have a lot of great talent around him. It was Sean Kemp way past his prime, and Grant Hill was injured. I mean, the one offensive option he had to help him out for a decent amount of it was Mike Miller. So T-Mac was pulling off quite a decent carry job with the Orlando Magic. If Grant Hill would have never gotten hurt, those two together could have been a hell of a pairing, but unfortunately that just never happened, and it didn't take too long for McGrady to end up on the Houston Rockets, where, as we all know, he would deal with a bunch of injuries himself. Too bad, because at his peak he was really a special player. Injuries suck, man. That's all there is to it. Now, if he would have stayed with the Raptors, I mean, he and Vince Carter could have been a hell of a duo as well. Even before McGrady would have got injured, those couple of seasons having two guys who could put up 30-plus points every night, that could have been special.